Why hello my fellow apes, I hope you are well. Welcome to my third response to Ben Shapiro's The Atheist Delusion. In the first instalment, I dealt with Ben's rhetoric and his reliance on strawmanning and nutpicking fallacies. In the second, I fact-checked his references to reveal the quote-mining nature of his research, and in this episode I'm going to debunk what is by far the primary argument for the existence of God that he presents. Namely, the argument from change. It's a powerful argument, so we're told, that supposedly proves that atheists are deluded. So, let's become an expert.
Become an expert.
Or, more accurately, let's hear what an expert makes of Ben's presentation, namely Joe Schmid, who has not only interacted with Edward Fazer numerous times, but who's recently collaborated with Dr. Dan Linford on a relevant and pioneering book titled Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs. Joe very kindly gave me an hour of his time, to which I took full advantage and will be showing clips throughout this video. What's more, our full conversation is available to patrons and YouTube members, whom without I simply would not have the resources to create videos such as this. So, thank you. Right then, let's get to it, shall we? Let's begin by watching the entirety of what Ben has to say about the argument from change, and then we'll take the time to consider each and every one of his assertions, that is, each premise and his conclusion. Now, here's a fair warning, heed these words. With this being the documentary's primary argument for God's existence, we're treated to a solid, action-packed, non-stop 70 seconds to digest. Yes, 70 seconds. So grab your tankard that holds 2 coffees but still only counts as 1.
But still only counts as 1!
Because we're about to become experts.
Become an expert.
As it turns out, there are a bevy of logically consistent arguments offered on behalf of God. Take, for example, the first cause proof advanced by Aristotle as refined by Thomas Aquinas. Edward Fazer lays out the argument in his book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. The argument goes something like this. First, change exists in the world. But all change is the actualization of a potential for that change. So if something is changing, it's because there was a potential for that change in the thing. No potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it. So that means that all change is caused by something already actual. This means either there is an infinite regress of actualizers, or there is a purely actual actualizer. This is sort of like the old joke about the philosopher and the turtle. The philosopher is asked, what supports the earth? And he says, a turtle. And somebody says, well, what supports the turtle? And he says, another turtle. So what about that one? He says, it's turtles all the way down. The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle. There has to be one prime cause. That cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. So there's one unchanging cause that is purely actual. That is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all of the other changes.
So there you have it, folks. The argument that Ben gives the most amount of attention and detail to in his documentary. What do we think? Well, my first comment is that I ought to have filled my tankard with Johnny Walker Black because coffee just doesn't cut it. What we've just seen from Ben is intense, unadulterated, giga-chad, turbo cringe. Now, look, don't you be snowflaking on me. You might be thinking that I'm being a little uncharitable here, but I promise you that by the end of this video, you'll appreciate why I'd make such a comment. What Ben said is turbo cringe, and that is a fact that doesn't care about your feelings. Just give me a chance, please, give me a chance to meet my burden of proof. So let's begin with the first statement.
As it turns out, there are a bevy of logically consistent arguments offered on behalf of God.
I commented on this in my first video, but it's worth repeating here. Saying that there's logically coherent arguments for God's existence isn't a triumph. It's so trivial, in fact, as to reveal just how little Ben knows about philosophy and logic. We can construct logically coherent arguments for just about any proposition whatsoever. For instance, the miasma theory of disease. Premise 1. If people get cholera by going to places with bad air, then the miasma theory is true. Premise 2. People get cholera by going to places with bad air. Conclusion, the miasma theory is true. Or to illustrate the point more directly, premise 1, if you're watching this video, then you're on Mars. Premise 2, you are watching this video. Conclusion, you're on Mars. These arguments are logically consistent. They're deductive arguments, and so their conclusion necessarily follows from their premises. If their premises are true, then their conclusion is also true. So having a bevy of logically consistent arguments doesn't make them good arguments. All an argument needs to be logically consistent is to not contradict itself, and that is an exceedingly low bar. Hell, it's even lower than low bar Beal's bar, and that's on the damn floor. Now, if we want to be what Ben never is, that is, charitable, and we will, we can suggest, as I did in my first video, that by logically consistent, Ben means that there are sound arguments for God's existence. That is, arguments whose premises are not only valid, but also actually true. They're supported by an abundance of evidence. But in any case, it's worth commenting on this, if only because we're meant to be becoming experts by listening to Ben for 15 minutes or less. And at least according to philosophy, this is a rudimentary distinction. Moving on, let's get to the actual argument.
First, change exists in the world, but all change is the actualization of a potential for that change.
Okay, so first and foremost, this claim that change is the actualization of a potential is just flatly asserted. Ben offers no justification for this whatsoever. It's as if he thinks this claim is so self-evidently true that it doesn't need defending, but it very much does. Let's ask an actual expert, shall we, of what to make of Ben's claim. So, Joe, Ben opens his presentation by stating that all change is the actualization of a potential for that change, and he offers no defense whatsoever for this claim. He states it as if it's self-evident. What do you make of this?
Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely not self-evident. And at least in terms of Ben's video, he didn't provide any justification for it. As you pointed out, he just kind of flatly asserted it. Now, it's actually extremely controversial in metaphysics, the view of change as the actualization of potential. And it makes really controversial assumptions about existence that, in fact, the vast majority of philosophers would reject. For instance, this analysis of change assumes ontological pluralism, which is the view that there are different kinds or types of existence. Fraser himself recognizes this on pages 176 to 184 of his book, 5 Proofs. In particular, Ben's claim assumes that there's an actual kind of existence on the one hand, as distinct from a potential kind of existence on the other hand. And to me, this just seems implausible. Like, by my lights, something either actually exists or it doesn't exist at all, right? It's not as though there's some like actual existence and then there's some like spooky or ghostly potential existence that's in between actual existence and sheer nothingness. To me, that just seems really implausible. Moreover, as philosopher Kris McDaniel points out, and he's one of like the foremost proponents of ontological pluralism, he points out in his book, The Fragmentation of Being, that the denial of ontological pluralism is by far the dominant view among contemporary philosophers. So we're not talking about some pre-philosophical, obvious, innocuous claim that Ben can take on board without justification. He needs significant justification for this, and he needs to contend with the vast majority of philosophers who reject it.
Now that's a really serious problem for Ben, isn't it? He's either issued an extremely controversial claim and has supported it with no evidence whatsoever deliberately, or he's so blinded by his echo chamber that he's not even aware that this is a controversial claim. For what it's worth, I think it's more likely that the latter is true, but in any case, this is a very big problem for Ben and his ilk. When foremost proponents of ontological pluralism, which is the view that there are different ways or modes of being, state at the very beginning of their works that by far the dominant view is unitary, any premise to the contrary is gonna need a solid defense. Sincerely, this can't be understated. It's akin to Ben arguing that ghosts are real, and stating as a first premise that our consciousness survives death with no evidence whatsoever. He's expressed an extremely controversial claim as if it doesn't need defending. What are we to make of this? The natural response is to swing Hitchens' razor. What can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. But if change isn't related to the act-potency distinction, what is change? Well, there's many models, and Joe kindly expressed one of the most prominent.
Yeah, so there are a bunch of different analyses of change in the philosophical literature. You could analyze change as an object gaining or losing a property. So for instance, you could take a banana. First, it starts off as green. It changes to yellow, and so it gains the property of being yellow. And then it changes to brown. So it gains the property of being brown. It loses the property of being yellow.
So there's just one alternative to the act-potency view of change that Ben and his ilk insist upon. And with Ben failing to defend his model, we can simply move on. But if you're like me, you'll want to know a little bit more about why precisely philosophers tend to reject Ben's model. In addition to denying ontological pluralism, what's another reason philosophers reject the claim that change is the actualization of potential?
Yeah, so one salient reason is that the analysis of change here assumes that eternalism is false. So, eternalism is the view that all times, both past and present and future, are equally actual, they're equally real. Under eternalism, then, time is basically a dimension along which objects are extended, and spacetime is like a four-dimensional static block, as it were. Now, Ben's analysis assumes that eternalism is false. And to see that, note that there's obviously change over time, right? A plant is at one point a sapling, and then at a later point, it's a fully grown tree. But then it's false under eternalism that such changes involve a transition from potentially existent things or attributes to actually existent things or attributes, right? Both the beginning and endpoints of that change are equally actual if eternalism is true. And so there's no transition here from potentiality to actuality. So what that tells us is that Ben's analysis of change assumes that eternalism is false. But here's the thing. Eternalism is a formidable view with lots of arguments in its favor. So for instance, general relativity, which is exceptionally empirically confirmed, seems to treat spacetime as a four-dimensional manifold, in accord with eternalism. Similarly, special relativity arguably disallows absolute simultaneity, and so casts doubt on a privileged objective present moment, and consequently casts doubt on non-eternalist theories of time, which of course, posit such a privileged present moment.
To rephrase Joe's words, then, there are numerous models for change, with each offering explanatory value in exchange for ontological baggage. That is, things you've got to commit yourself to. And the reason that the vast majority of metaphysicians reject the act potency model that the likes of Ben and Edward Feser rely upon is, 1, because other models do just as good a job of explaining change without necessitating that we buy into all sorts of additional propositions, and 2, the act potency view assumes the falsity of eternalism, which is the most prominent model of time among philosophers and scientists. Stated otherwise, we effectively have a very strong rebutting defeater to Ben's model. Yeah, do you see what I mean when I say that this claim from Ben being undefended is problematic? At the risk of overstating the point, when faced with your car keys missing, you could explain this in terms of ghosts stealing them. But the price of this explanation is exceedingly expensive. Among many other things, you'd need to commit yourself to the view that consciousness is independent of the brain, and that intangible entities can physically interact with tangible entities. Given this, if there's competing theories that are cheaper in terms of what you've got to buy, and also offer sufficient explanatory value, such as that your car keys fell out of your pocket while you were walking to your car, then the reasonable conclusion is to opt for the simpler theory. This is Occam's razor, otherwise known as the principle of parsimony. When two or more theories offer an explanation, the one that makes fewer assumptions is more likely to be correct. So there's Ben's first premise dealt with. Let's move on to his second.
No potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it. So that means that all change is caused by something already actual.
Once again, notice that this premise is flatly asserted with no evidence. Ben offered no justification for this, and so once again, what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. And that's it. We can move on. But I want to give you some food for thought. For intrigue, how does Feser tend to defend this premise?
Yeah, so Feser offers several different justifications in his 5 proofs book for this causal principle. Most of his justifications, though, are essentially the same as those given on behalf of the Kalam's causal principle that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And you and I, Stephen, have actually systematically criticized those in our Kalam series. Really, what we say, exactly. So what we say in our Kalam series will generally apply with minor modifications to Feser's justifications. So, he appeals to things like intuition and induction and abduction and the argument from chaos. He appeals to that, etc. And we level a variety of criticisms that are going to be applying to Feser's case. So we do that in our Kalam series.
Now, likewise to what we did in regards to Ben's first unwarranted assumption, let's go further by asking why his second unwarranted assumption is considered controversial.
Yeah, so one reason it's controversial is that you might find it pretty implausible, as I do. To me, it's pretty plausible that some actualizations of potential can be explained without being causally actualized by something already actual. There are many non-causal explanations. There are explanations in terms of grounding, in terms of functional realization, in terms of logical and structural constraints, and so much more. Graham Oppy actually makes this point in response to Fazer in a paper that he published in the journal Religious Studies. We can explain why, for instance, a chair's potential to exist at the next moment is actualized by citing, say, the absence of anything that destroys the chair. I mean, that seems to be a perfectly legitimate, illuminating explanation of why the chair's potential to exist at the next moment is actualized. And yet notice that we don't cite anything that causally actualizes the chair's potential to exist at the next moment. It's not as though we're citing something already actual which causally produced it. We're just citing the absence of factors that destroy it. And actually, my co-author and I, in our book, we give more precise and worked out explanatory schemas like this in the chapters on existential inertia.
Brilliant. To bring this all back into context, likewise to Ben's first premise, Ben's second premise cries out for a defense, and yet Ben offers none. Zero. Not a word. He straight up spat out wild claims with no evidence as if they're going out of fashion. Add to this Graham Oppy's point that we can explain a chair's potential to exist at the next moment by citing the absence of anything that destroys the chair, then the cost of Ben's assertions are further illuminated. He wants us to buy massive claims for no reason other than to establish his presupposed theism. It's akin to him wanting us to believe that ghosts can move physical objects, and his inability to contend with rival theories that explain the absence of the keys makes it extremely obvious that he started with his conclusion and is working backwards. Or I should say, it does to me, at least. Anyhow, with that, let's hear the next assertion. It's short, but it's of crucial consideration.
This means either there is an infinite regress of actualizers, or there is a purely actual actualizer.
Now, what do you think of this claim, Joe? That there's either one, an infinite regress of actualizers, or two, there's a purely actual actualizer.
Yeah, so that's an obviously false dichotomy. Look closely at the two options that we're being presented with here. Either one, the regress is infinite, or else two, the regress is finite and terminates in a purely actual actualizer. But there's an obvious third option here. The third option is that the regress is finite and terminates in something other than a purely actual actualizer. At most, the terminating member of the regressive actualizers simply needs to be unactualized. That doesn't mean that it's purely actual. It just means that it doesn't have a further cause that actualizes it. That clearly doesn't mean that it has no potential whatsoever. It just means that its potentials, if it has them, are not currently being actualized by an outside cause. In short, Ben totally mistakenly assumes that unactualized implies purely actual, and it clearly doesn't.
What we're looking at, then, is a black and white fallacy from Ben. While it's true to say that the regress is either infinite or finite, this isn't what Ben said. What he said is that the regress is either infinite or it's finite and terminates in something purely actual, that is, something that has no potential. But there's an obvious third option. The regress could be finite and terminates in something not purely actual, that is, something that has potential. From here, Ben debunked, at least as far as he's concerned, the view that the regress is infinite. Let's recall how he did it.
So what about that one? It's turtles all the way down. The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle.
Ben very impressively debunks the infinite regress argument, of course, by saying the infinite regress argument is just not convincing. What are your thoughts to his prowess here?
Yeah, so firstly, that's just flatly asserted in the video. No justification was offered for it, and of course, that which is asserted without evidence is dismissed without evidence.
Yep, that was it. Ben just dismissed infinite regress on account of it not being, according to him, convincing. You know, I don't know why we even bother with logic and reason when we can just pull a BS and dismiss things so easily. What's that? You think God exists? Yeah, that's just not convincing.
Debunked.
Yeah, debunked. Good game, guys. Sorry, you had a good run, I'll give you that, but it's over, you're done.
Note that Fazer and others attempt to give justifications for this step. it's not exactly clear whether or not their justifications succeed. And actually, there have been some reasonable criticisms of their justifications in a recent paper by philosopher Thomas Oberle published in the International Journal for Philosophy of Religion. So if the audience wants to check that out, they can do that. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the burden of proof here is on Shapiro to establish that there cannot be an infinite regress of this sort, right? It's not enough for him to say that it's not convincing that there's an infinite regress. He has the burden of proof here. He's the one who needs to convincingly show that an infinite regress is impossible. By saying that an infinite regress is not convincing, he doesn't give any reason whatsoever to think that an infinite regress is impossible. Right? Imagine that we're discussing, Stephen, you and I are discussing how many stars there are in the observable universe. I confidently proclaim that there is an even number of stars. You, being a little bit more skeptical, respond that in order to show that the number of stars is even, I'd have to rule out the view that the number of stars is odd. Now imagine that I retort by saying, well, there being an odd number of stars is not convincing. I mean, that's just an obviously silly response. And yet it's exactly what Shapiro has done. It's exactly what Shapiro has done.
Indeed, Ben's debunking is lackluster. But with that, let's move on to his next statement, that while being just a few words is of vital importance.
There has to be one prime cause.
He's just said straight up that there has to be one prime cause. What do you make of that?
Well, what am I supposed to make of it? I mean, it's just an assertion. It's just an assertion. Why one? Why not more than one? I mean, he gives literally no justification. Again, I recognize that it's a short video, but like, can he not try a little bit harder to give some justifications? I guess not.
Yeah, I guess not. It's a shame, but hey, this is just how Ben rolls. Moving on to Ben's next claim, let's recall what he had to say.
That cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing.
Ben's next claim is that the cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. What's your thoughts on this claim?
So the first problem is that this is just clearly false. It doesn't follow from the fact that it has potential that something else could activate it into changing. And the reason for this is that it could actualize its own potential. Things actualize their own potentials all the time. I actualize my potential to engage in this conversation with you, for instance. So Ben here is just flatly wrong. I mean, it doesn't follow that something else could activate it into changing.
There, then, is the first issue with Ben's claim here. It's obviously false. Ben claims that we can infer from the fact that his first cause hasn't changed that it doesn't have the potential to change, but this just doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur. If we tentatively grant Ben's other premises, we get to something that's uncaused or unactualized, sure, but it does not follow from this that it's impossible for this thing to be caused or unactualized. As Joe said, entities can cause or actualize their own potential.
A second problem for Shapiro's claim here is that even if something else could activate the cause into changing, so what? Again, Shapiro hasn't shown that this thing is incapable of change. That is, that it has no potential whatsoever for change. At best, we can only conclude that the terminus of the regress of actualizers is unactualized. That doesn't mean that it's unactualizable, i.e., not even capable of being actualized.
To state Joe's point through analogy, suppose we are playing bingo and the first number to be pulled out is 17. While it's true that in this game 17 uniquely doesn't have a number that was pulled before it, it doesn't follow from this that in all possible bingo games 17 doesn't have a number pulled before it. Likewise, and given Ben's premises, while the specific entity that the regress ends in is unactualized, it doesn't follow that it's unactualizable. To utilize possible world semantics, we have no reason to rule out that in other possible worlds it's actualized. Moreover, even if the unactualized actualizer is unactualizable with respect to its existence, it doesn't follow that it's unactualizable in all other respects. Now, I appreciate that we're getting into technical waters here, which are far deeper than the surface level of Ben. If you're comfortable at this depth, then I recommend reading Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs. For our purposes here, however, we'll get back to Ben and his conclusion.
That is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all of the other changes.
The final claim that Ben makes, his conclusion, if you will, is that is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all the other changes. Are you now, good sir, a theist?
Yes, I'm a theist. I just subscribed, in fact, 2 minutes ago to the Daily Wire. And I gave a little thumbs up to the Atheist Illusion video. I'm definitely not a theist after hearing that. My first thought is, where did that come from? No justification was given for that at all. It's just absurd. Okay, so that's my first thought. Now, note that Phaser, at least, in his book, 5 Proofs, does try to justify the inference to God here, but Phaser's justifications entirely fail, as I show in chapter 8 of this book. That's the first point. The second point is that there are countless non-theistic proposals for what a purely actual actualizer might be. It might be a foundational, intrinsically unchanging quantum field or universal wave function. We actually developed that proposal in depth in the chapter 8 that I just mentioned. It might be fundamental, intrinsically unchanging particles. It might be foundational relations in the spirit of ontic structural realism. There's a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry that talks about this. It could be an absolutely simple, transcendent, impersonal reality, like Plotinus's one. It could be Brahman, conceived impersonally. It could be the Tao. It could be any of dozens upon dozens of other candidates. So it's just absurdly unjustified to say that it's God.
That it is. Even if we grant all of Ben's premises, his conclusion is still absurd. He insists that the unactualized actualizer is God, but gives us no reason to accept this. As Joe said, there's a bevy of candidates, and of course, most of these candidates come with fewer ontological commitments. Now we could end here, but Joe went on to give some powerful reasons to think that the unactualized actualizer isn't God. Here's the first.
And then my third thought on this is that there are actually potentially powerful arguments against a conception of God as purely actual or devoid of any potentials. Here are just a few of those arguments. I don't claim that they're knockdown arguments, but they might seem at least initially quite plausible. So the first one is from changing divine knowledge. So remember that Ben's argument requires denying eternalism to maintain his act potency analysis of change. And so what that means is that the argument requires a dynamic view of time, where the facts of reality genuinely come to be and pass away as time dynamically progresses, as reality grows, as it were. But if the facts themselves come to be and pass away, for instance, if dinosaurs once existed but then ceased to exist altogether, then statements about those facts change in their truth value. What that means is that they either go from being false to being true, or they go from being true to being false. So for instance, the statement dinosaurs exist went from true to false once dinosaurs went extinct, right? Once dinosaurs ceased to exist, that statement that dinosaurs exist, that went from being true to being false. It went from accurately describing reality to not accurately describing reality. But if statements change their truth value like that, then God's knowledge must likewise change. Why is that? Well, knowledge is factive. What that means is that you can only know that a statement P is true if P is, in fact, true, right? In other words, you can't know that P if P is false. So for example, 1 + 1 = 2. I surmise that we all agree with that. And because it's true, you can't sensibly be said to know that 1 + 1 is not 2, right? That just doesn't make any sense. So what this implies is that if a statement P really does go from being true to being false, well then, once P is false, one cannot know that P, right? For if one still knew that P, well then, since knowing that P presupposes P's truth, as we just saw, P would have remained true, right? But again, we're supposing that P changed in truth value, and hence it did not remain true. And so if some statement P goes from being true to being false, then God himself goes from knowing P to not knowing P. And in particular, right, since God is omniscient, he's going to have to go from knowing P to knowing it is not the case that P. Still a change in knowledge. But crucially, right, if God goes from knowing P to not knowing P, then God has potential to acquire knowledge that he did not already possess. And in that case, God can't be purely actual. He can't be devoid of all potentials. He minimally has to have potentials to grow in his knowledge.
Joe's objection here clearly illustrates the tension between the argument from change, which denies eternalism, and God's omniscience, which entails some highly counterintuitive and potentially heretical conclusions. If Ben and his supporters insist that God has no potential whatsoever, then God neither has the potential to acquire new knowledge, nor the potential to do away with beliefs in facts that are no longer facts. And that doesn't exactly scream omniscience, does it? From here, Joe went on to give another instance of friction, namely with prayer.
A second argument along these lines has to do with prayer. So if God is purely actual, then he can't be actualized by anything. This much Ben and Phaser, etc., agree with. But if God can't be actualized by anything, well, then God can't be causally influenced in any way, since causation involves one thing actualizing another thing in some way. But in that case, your prayers cannot affect God in any way. And at least on its face, right, that seems to be a big yikes. Like, your prayers can't affect God. Yikes. I mean, just imagine that you told the typical believer in the pew that. Imagine that you told your prayers have literally no effect on God whatsoever. That's a big yikes.
Yeah, that's a big yikes. At least it will be for most people who believe in God. I mean, really? God can't be moved by prayers at all. All the communication that he received in the holy books and all the prayers he's received from the dawn of humankind were, in a fundamental sense, unheard. Really? And then finally, Joe gave yet another reason to be theologically suspicious of Ben's claim that is specific to Christians. Ben isn't, of course, a Christian, but much of his audience is, and so it's worth hearing this consideration.
And then the third argument specifically targets a Christian doctrine, and it's the doctrine of the incarnation. Right? So for Christians, God became incarnate. But what that means is that God went from not being incarnate to being incarnate. And that at least seems on its face to imply that God had the potential to become incarnate, which was actualized at some point. And if that's the case, well, then God can't be purely actual, or at least so some have argued.
So there's just 3 reasons to be theologically concerned about Ben's insistence that the unactualized actualizer, which is predicated on a load of unwarranted claims, is specifically God. If his model is correct, then God's omniscience is dubious. He apparently doesn't answer prayers, and the whole God incarnate thing has yet another notch of absurdity in its belt. If you found Joe's insight useful, as I do, then I highly recommend heading over to his channel, The Majesty of Reason. And if you'd like to learn more about the topics we've discussed in this video, then consider adding Joe and Daniel Linford's book, Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs, to your reading list. I'm going to wrap up in just a moment, and yes, I'll make clear that I have met my burden of proof. But should you be interested in seeing the conversation I had with Joe in full, then please do consider becoming a patron or YouTube member for as little as $2 a month. If you can supply me with a coffee or something indeed stronger to aid me in addressing the likes of Ben, then I'd greatly appreciate it. Here's the question. Have I met my burden of proof? Well, let's recall. Ben's first claim, that
all change is the actualization of a potential for that change,
is extremely controversial, and yet he offered no support for it whatsoever. None. His second claim is that
no potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it. So that means that all change is caused by something already actual.
And yet again, he offered no reason for us to accept this. None. Ben then inferred from this that
this means either there is an infinite regress of actualizers, or there is a purely actual actualizer.
Which is obviously a black and white fallacy. Then he debunked the infinite regress argument by saying
the infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle.
Which, of course, isn't even an objection. From here, Ben claimed that
there has to be one prime cause,
but gave us no reason at all to believe this. None. Then he claimed
that cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing.
Which is a non sequitur. And then, finally, he claimed that the unactualized actualizer is God, despite there being a bevy of alternative candidates that don't cost as much in terms of commitment.
That is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all of the other changes.
So Ben's primary argument for God's existence, or at least the argument that he gave the most effort to, consists of 4 extremely controversial claims with no evidence. 1 black and white fallacy, 1 non sequitur fallacy, and a rejection of infinite regress due to it being unconvincing. That, my fellow apes, is turbo cringe. Consider my burden of proof completely and utterly fulfilled.
Debunked.
Debunked. Debunked. Debunked.
And just in case you don't know who Joe is, he is a scholar that focuses on metaphysics and philosophy and theology in general. He's published over 12 times. I think it's 12, is it? Or it might be more. He's got 2 books.
Well, yeah. He's that was the dumbest thing. That's the dumbest thing you could have said. Firstly, you can analyze change as an object gaining or losing a property. So I might grow in height, or I might shrink in height, etc. I might shrink. Who shrinks? Infinite regress argument is just not convincing.
debunk.